fall and to speak with my friend and colleague Ilyse Hogue, who's the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America. I know we're going to be talking about a topic that we all are very passionate about, reproductive freedom. In fact, I'll never forget that when I first started here at Americans United, I went to New York and I met with one of our members who is an octogenarian man. And I was talking with him about how he connects to the issue of church-state separation. His response was abortion rights. And in membership survey after membership survey, we have found that you all feel the same, which is to say that reproductive freedom is the top or tied for the top priority for many of our members. And I think it's because you understand intuitively the connection between reproductive freedom and religious freedom, mainly that without religious freedom, without the separation of religion and government, that there would be no reproductive freedom and that we wouldn't have access to abortion, to contraception, sterilization, which are all crucial parts of not just our healthcare, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but also crucial to equality and equity and autonomy and dignity. So I know you're all there in your hearts, and many of you are also very educated about the topic, but if you want to be able to meticulously make the case about the linkages between religious freedom and reproductive freedom, you must read this book, The Lie That Binds, and listen to the excellent companion podcast as well, which goes by the same name. So in the book and podcast, Ilyse and her research team at NARAL Pro-Choice America recount the history of how the formerly nonpartisan issue of abortion rights was appropriated by the radical right to maintain white patriarchal control in a very changing world, and how together we can stop them. So let me pause for a moment before we launch into it and tell you a little bit about how we're going to structure this time together. After I introduce Ilyse, she's going to read a passage from her book and tell us a little bit about the book in her own words. Then I'll interview Ilyse and we'll discuss it a little bit, and we will allow plenty of time for your questions at the end. So I'll just ask that as we go, you can drop your questions into the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen on the right. So I got to know Ilyse when I was the deputy director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. And I was putting together for our biennial an event on reproductive freedom and abortion rights. And we wanted to have some knock it out of the ballpark speaker, someone to attract the crowds. We knew that our folks were really into the issue. And I just kept hearing again and again that the new president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, Ilyse Hogue, was the bomb. Smart, strategic, political, and she's really all of that. So for me, from the moment she spoke at the biennial, I was sold, and I actually had the honor of joining the NARAL Pro-Choice America board, which I served on, I think it was like 6 years, and I only recently stepped off only because this job is a little bit busy. But we work together very closely, our organizations, all the time, and I'm very proud of that, and strategically they're wonderful partners to our issue. So Ilyse has been at the helm of NARAL Pro-Choice America since 2013, and her organization, this organization that we all love so much, which is now 50 years old, by the way, NARAL Pro-Choice America, has become a true organizing powerhouse, now with a membership of 2.5 million strong, advancing state and federal legislation to protect and expand abortion access, and of course, fighting an unprecedented wave of bans on abortion, in particular at the state level. So her work, I'll just conclude by saying this, and then I'll turn it over to Ilyse, that her work is not only substantively moving the needle, destigmatizing abortion, and helping the pro-choice side win again. It's also inspiring so many of us, myself included, to believe in the power of our own voices, which is so important right now. So Ilyse, I'm delighted that you decided to invest in this book and honored that you are joining us today for this conversation. And why don't you begin however you'd want, but I know you want to read a passage and get into your book a little bit.
I do. I'll probably save much commentary for afterwards, but I do want to thank Rachel and the whole Americans United team for everything you do all the time, but to Rachel for her leadership and her friendship. It was a bittersweet moment when she got the job because I knew that she was the perfect person for the moment that we are in. And at the same time, as much as she didn't want to believe it, I know how consuming these jobs are. And so I knew that we would lose her from the NARAL Pro-Choice America board, and lose her we did, but I've never lost her counsel or her friendship or the indelible legacy that she has left on the NARAL Pro-Choice America board. And I'm just thrilled and impressed. I mean, I see like 123 AU, do you call yourselves AU, members here today. And I want to thank you all because you are so crucial at this moment in history. This is a pinnacle of everything you guys have been fighting against and fighting for. And the next chapter will be determined by those of us who choose to engage. And you are clearly people who choose to engage. So thank you very much. I know we're going to have a conversation, and that conversation will probably include things like, why would I ever write a book when I'm leading an organization? Am I a crazy person? The answer to that is yes. So I will actually not do a lot of prefacing of the book other than to say that I had a question that I needed to answer for myself when I came to NARAL, and it was, how can so many people stand for something so fundamental, and yet the country, its policies and its politicians are going in the other direction? And as I set off on that journey to answer that question, I, with my team, uncovered a tremendous amount of wisdom, knowledge, history that led to the story. And, you know, it's a book, I'm proud of it. I hope you guys like it. I want to be clear. We stand on the shoulders of so many people who actually have been telling this story iteratively, particularly, but not exclusively, women of color who have been experiencing the impacts of our ignorance around the true history on these issues and the radical right. And so this book actually came out of a conversation and a challenge from one of my favorite people, a woman by the name of Loretta Ross, who is a founder of the reproductive justice movement. As we were discussing the history, the true history, not the history the radical right would tell you, but the true history, she really said, go tell your people about this, right? Like the traditional NARAL audience doesn't know this story, and knowledge is power. And without that knowledge, we're not going to do things differently. And so that is how this book came to be. I will read a short passage and we will converse from there. People like Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell had always drawn political benefit from stoking racial animus to sow cultural discord. This cynical exploitation never stopped, but efforts became more coded in the 1970s as the successes of the civil rights movement showed quickly growing public support for at least the theory of racial equality. So when the movement architects saw Phyllis Schlafly's accomplishments in defeating the ERA, they understood it as a ripe opportunity to add gender concerns to their efforts to defend the preservation of white patriarchal systems of control, or as they called it, the natural family. Schlafly's mastery at using identity politics provided a blueprint for the future of the new radical right. Maxwell and Shields underscored her influence in their book, The Long Southern Strategy. The politicization of these Southern white conservative and more often than not religious women in opposition to second wave feminism resuscitated and kept the GOP strategy alive. The cult of Southern white womanhood had primed this audience for generations. Thus, the anti-feminism rallying cry became as successful as the well-known dog whistles of race and religion. It is, in fact, a bridge between the two. Schlafly's work was proof of concept. The evangelicals that Weyrich and Falwell had managed to activate were sensitive to more than just a loss of white supremacy. Weyrich and Falwell were convinced that at a moment when civil rights leaders were making advances and overtly racist appeals were losing their power, they would soft pedal their racism and persuade more Americans to fear the impact of giving freedom and power to women. Since racism and misogyny have always been tangled in American society, finding the right balance that kept just enough women on board was key to success. And that is where adapting the message to appeal to fundamentalist religion came in. As Maxwell and Shields wrote, the Southern way of life is not based solely on white superiority. Rather, it is best viewed as a triptych with religious fundamentalism and patriarchy standing as separate hinged panels that can be folded inward, bent to cover or reinforce white supremacy throughout much of the region's history. As the moral majority was gaining steam in the late 70s, other leaders of the radical right caught the wave and set about building their own women's auxiliary. Moral majority board member Tim LaHaye, who would later become something of a cult sensation as the author of the apocalyptic Christian series Left Behind, encouraged his wife Beverly to launch a complementary effort targeting women. In 1978, Beverly founded Concerned Women for America, an organization that still exists today. By that time, President Jimmy Carter had officially enacted new IRS rules to strip segregation academies of their tax-exempt status for good, capping the decade-long battle and legal and political battle. The age of government-sanctioned segregation was supposed to be over, although the struggle for equality in the schools continues to this day. Schlafly's campaign had effectively defeated the ERA by the 1979 deadline for ratification. The architects of the radical right found themselves in a conundrum. They knew they could energize a coalition of millions by stoking fear of cultural change and lost privilege, but their pet issues were losing relevance. They needed a new focus, a hot-button cultural issue that could channel social conservatism into real political allegiance. They needed an issue that was hot enough to resonate with an energized base, but not too hot that it would burn the Republican Party. In the late 70s, Weyrich joined a conference called for evangelical leaders to debate what would replace segregation as their focus for the next rallying cry of their new movement. A number of ideas were batted about, but none of them were just quite right. They probed for a hook that triggered a powerful emotional reaction against the cultural changes underway, something that tapped deep into wells of racism and misogyny without coming off to the public as obviously racist or misogynistic. They wanted to bake their cake and eat it too. Finally, someone on the end of one of the lines made a fateful suggestion. How about abortion? That singular voice forever changed the landscape of American politics.
It's incredible. It's really incredible. I think that quote that you read that talks about the triptych and how it's just such a visual image for me of patriarchy and religious fundamentalism sort of folding in a way to disguise in this phony moral cloak what is really white supremacy, and that's what this was rooted in. I think is a story that is still actually way too little known about how abortion became a political issue. And I mean, there's so many fascinating facts in your book, but it's just, in terms of the way the religious right, as we often call them, sort of got involved as part of this movement, that really before 1984, or in that election where I guess 66% of evangelical fundamentalists came out for Reagan, that the evangelical sort of fundamentalist movement didn't exist as a political movement. And how about this fact that many of you may know, which is in 1973, after the Roe v. Wade decision came out, that the Baptist press, speaking for the Southern Baptist Convention, praised the decision as being one about religious freedom. And I mean, it's almost hard to believe, and it becomes complicated, at least on our side in terms of terminology, because even though the theology wasn't there and it shifted very intentionally to match this political strategy, then the theology became integrated, right, into this wing of evangelical Christianity, of white evangelical Christianity. And so a whole new generation of people were raised believing that this sort of anti-choice stuff was a fundamental piece of their theology, and it's sort of mind-boggling to see how theology shifts to be political. But I guess that leads me to my first question for you, which is, I noticed in the book that you most often use the terminology radical right when you were describing this movement. And sometimes you interchanged it in certain places with religious right, but you primarily used radical right. And I wanted to know more about what that distinction looks like in your mind.
This is one of the reasons I love Rachel. When I got this question in advance, she zeroed in on the thing that we literally spent the most amount of time talking about, which was terminology in the book. And how do you use terminology familiar enough to a reader who is unfamiliar with the story without actually perpetuating stereotypes that benefit the cause of the other side, right? And so, we started from a place, I'm sure your members understand that we would never use pro-life, even though they have adopted that term. We started saying anti-choice. And then part of what happened was that as we did our research, we started to actually be able to document the fact that there was literally no light of day from what we would call anti-choice groups, anti-choice ideology, anti-choice infrastructure, right? And the rest of the right. So we started from a place of wanting to dismantle the wall that, over here you have what media would too often call your pro-life groups, and then you've got your radical right groups over here. And in fact, we were saying they're one and the same. And then we didn't want to give them the cover of religion when it was clear and documented that their goal was power and control. And at the same time, we had to acknowledge the fact that they were effective because they used religion as a culture. So we opted to, the most common term we use is radical right. There were very specific places, particularly where we were talking about them in self-referential terms, right? Like they call themselves the religious right. So to acknowledge that sort of moniker that they have successfully adopted over the years, while not just using that as though it's fact, because nothing could be further from the truth. And, I often get asked, where did the name come from, right? Like, what is the lie that binds? And, the central lie that they have been successful in getting away with is that they are or ever were driven by religious or moral concern for outcomes of individual pregnancies. Nothing could be further from the truth. They are and have always been driven by a incredibly zealous desire to maintain very tight hegemonic control for a very small group of people in a changing society.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's funny because part of what goes on in my head when I think of the term radical right is part of what was sort of in the very end of your book about, one of the solutions, which is like all of us banding together, because if we're fighting this power structure that seeks to maintain these traditional white, Christian, male, straight, cisgender power, then we all need to come together and fight it together. And sort of radical right sort of is that broad way of describing that movement that is sort of against all of us having equality, and so many of us. But I was interested in it as well, just because we did our first poll ever last year at Americans United, and a really probing poll. And what we found is that religious right, which is a term that our movement has very commonly used and that a lot of our members really relate to and grew up with, and they know who we're talking about quickly when we say religious right. But it turns out to be a term that a surprising number of Americans, let's say, actually positively associate with, or just don't even understand, like the religious is right or something, you know what I mean? And, because
I think into one of their central strategies, one of the reasons I talk often, notes from that conference call I talked about are sketchy. They mostly rely on first-person accounts of people that were on there. There is evidence that one of the issues that they bandied about was contraception. And, it's really interesting to me because we also hear a lot like, well, if they're against abortion, why wouldn't they want everyone to have contraception, right? In fact, what is less talked about that we talk about in the book is that a year before Roe, the Supreme Court case came down that actually legalized contraception for unmarried women. And that was in many ways much more of a cultural upheaval than Roe, right? This was, remember, against the backdrop of sexual liberation and, the days of the hippies, and for traditional families, like that might have felt threatening. I wasn't around, I don't know, I've heard, there was like a backlash for traditional housewives that in the age of free love, like, someone might come take their husbands. And then what was happening is women were entering the workplace and not having to leave because they got pregnant, because they were on contraception. So they were challenging men in the workplace for access to the C-suite, pay equity, workplaces free of harassment. That was much more uncomfortable and felt widespread than any effective Roe, right? But it was determined that it was too popular. Contraception was just too popular to attack head on. And the reason that I think that this is important is both because obviously they're not just about abortion, right? Like even within the reproductive freedom and justice spectrum, we see them attacking contraception, sexual education, and on the other end of the spectrum, not funding things like prenatal care and paid family leave. But I believe it's even deeper than that. What they were gambling on when they chose abortion, and Rachel referenced this at the beginning of the call, was stigma. And it was less stigma about abortion, which was still just considered a medical procedure, than it was about women who would dare to have sex outside of the intent to procreate, right? And women on top of that who, if they got pregnant from that sex, were so selfish that they wouldn't carry that pregnancy to term. And then you overlay the sort of race conversation at the time, and you already had in the late 70s during Reagan's first campaign, which he lost, him peddling the myths about welfare queens, right? And like really racializing the idea of promiscuous women and single parenthood. And that's the stigma that we never talk about, right? That is the stigma that was at the root of the success of their strategy to use abortion as a dog whistle or a litmus test for people who were just hostile to individuals, particularly women and people of color living their lives on their own terms.
So that's really interesting. I mean, I was going to ask you actually next, and I think you've just sort of answered it. Like, why did abortion work? Why did it stick? And I think, you've been answering that. I mean, the racial overtones, and really it's linked to sort of gender norms around, women have less power ultimately than men and can't challenge men for their power. So I think that is all like a really important piece of the story. I also was interested in the book to see you talk about sort of this explaining the need, though, for them also to bring disinformation. I think you call it misinformation, disinformation to the table, because on its own, when push comes to shove, like even these, a lot of these parental notification ballot initiatives and things fail often, because like when people, go into the voting booth and have to pull the lever against actually allowing women to make that decision for themselves, like that's actually not where people are. It's not where the majority of Americans are. So it's like, it's an interesting tension, Ilyse, and how do you sort of reconcile it with the fact that, abortion and reproductive freedom is where public opinion lies. They're with us. And yet this still has worked in a pretty sweeping way for a pretty considerable voting base. And how does disinformation play into that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So part of why it worked, and Rachel alluded to this, and we can and should talk about this more, is because they recognize that those stigmas that we just talked about didn't really change people's opinion on abortion, but it caused them to withdraw from the conversation, were deeply uncomfortable. We were then, and we still are, talking about race, talking about sex. So they were counting on the unwillingness of people to engage silence as complicity that would allow them to get away with it, right? And then they layered on top of it disinformation and misinformation. And I think that this is really crucially important in two ways. Because first they actually had to build, remember Rachel talked about this, there was very, very little opposition to Roe when it came down. I'm from Dallas, Texas, the leading fundamentalist at the time, W.A. Criswell, actually put out a press release saying what's good for the mother is good for the family. The day Roe came out, I went to grade school with his granddaughter, but they had to actually train generations to believe that abortion was the ultimate evil, right? And that required a pretty Herculean task, right? At the time, Republicans and Democrats in equal numbers actually supported Roe and supported legal access to abortion. And if anything, sympathy was with generations of women who had suffered and people had witnessed the terrible effects of illegal abortion and risk and death and injury, right? So they set out to erase the woman or the pregnant person from the conversation entirely, to move sympathy to the potential life, the fetus. And in order to do that, it was hard, right? It was hard. They actually had to do a lot of different things, like misinformation was to sort of vilify women who would be so selfish and so self-serving to do these things, or victimize women who are kind of just not really smart enough to make their own decisions and therefore need to be protected through government intervention. And then to humanize the potential life by showing images of fully developed babies as 3-month-old fetuses, right? Like, and it was very visceral for people. And it never moved, it has never moved the needle on people's support for legal access to abortion. What it has done is force people, it has spawned a generation, a minority, but of people in this country who do genuinely believe that abortion is the ultimate evil. It has surfaced a really important litmus test that the Federalist Society started using in 1982 that showed that if you were going to express antipathy towards a woman being able to be in control of this decision, you were almost certainly going to express antipathy towards other forms of social progress anyway, which is why the Federalist Society used hostility towards Roe as a litmus test. Yeah. It also, and I think this is really important and really shocking, links to other, the disinformation that they used actually has deeply, deeply disturbing and craven origins. So, if we think about 2012, when Todd Akin, running for Senate in Missouri, talked about women don't need abortion in the case of legitimate rape, because if it's a legitimate rape, the body has a way of shutting that whole thing down. We trace that was an argument used when Henry Hyde was successful in imposing restrictions on low-income women and women of color through the Hyde Amendment that said you couldn't use public funding to access abortion. And we found it from there. He got it out of an Americans United for Life handbook dated to 1972 that was financed by Paul Weyrich, who we talk about in the excerpt, who was a founding father. Where did it come from there? It came from Paul Weyrich's main benefactors were the Coors family, who we know have ties to Nazism, and this came from experiments that were done in Auschwitz on Jewish prisoners.
Unbelievable. I mean,
so the idea that white supremacy and reproductive oppression are two different things is absolutely false.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very powerful case that you document, actually. I wanted to come back to words, what you've just been talking about a lot, and as part of the disinformation, this idea of forcible rape instead of just calling it rape, right? Which includes marital rape and date rape and all kinds of rape. And, and I was struck by, in the book where you talked about Paul Ryrick, right, who Ilyse has been referring to, who I think you guys refer in the book to like one of the godfathers of the radical right. And he said, and I'll quote, "Words are important. Words are powerful. The words we or the pro-choice activists use very clearly and frequently shape the value system of those who listen," right? And so he's, right, in his manual, right, he's the one who put down, say mother, don't say pregnant woman, and say womb, because it sounds softer and more inviting than uterus, etc., right? So, and I'll just say that in our own work at Americans United, we see the same strategy of misusing the sacred concept of religious freedom to actually be religious privilege. And so, we're very aware of this strategy. What I want to know is, what are the words that we use on the pro-choice side today that work well? And why do those work well?
One of the things, and this has been, Rachel was on the board for part of this, so it will be no surprise to her. We have really been quite intentional about our use of reproductive freedom. Because when you look at the 77% of Americans who support legal access to abortion, and then the cascading sort of rights and freedoms that come in that spectrum, that is what it means to them, right? And in fact, it is the perfect antonym. Is that the right word? Antonym? It sounded funny when I said it. To what they actually are convincible that the other side is about, which is control. Mm-hmm. And I remember having this conversation when we were fighting, unfortunately before Rachel was at Americans United, when we were fighting Hobby Lobby, right? And I remember that they were using the sort of like religious freedom, and freedom is very powerful, and religion is very powerful for people, right? And we, at the time, I was very new at NARAL, were very grounded in a healthcare, like contraception is healthcare. Let me be clear. Contraception is healthcare, right? And we do care about healthcare. Healthcare is incredibly important. But if you actually look at the psychology that they have studied so well, understanding the power of language and the way it plays in our heart and our gut, which is the way most people make decisions, there's a concept which many of you probably know called Maslov's hierarchy, which means we can actually think healthcare is really important, and we can think religious freedom is really important, but they're not going to be important the same. And so if I'm forced to choose between them, I'm going to go with the higher order value. Mm-hmm. Higher order value in people's minds is freedom and is religion. And they effortlessly wove both of those together, right? So we are really finding power in reclaiming the term of freedom. We are really finding power in terms like dignity, right? Everybody actually believes that humans and pregnant people deserve the dignity. And we're also really finding a lot of power in talking in plain terms about things like compassion. One of the things that the polls and message research show over and over, and it's like not the prettiest message, but like most people believe life is really messy. Mm-hmm. And everybody is doing the best in the individual circumstance that they face. And I may not agree with Rachel's decision, but I can still believe that she's doing the best thing, and I can understand that life is messy. And so when I actually use language as an advocate for reproductive freedom that talks about those higher level values, that actually paints an aspirational picture of a world where everyone has the dignity to make decisions with the compassion of their community, that helps us reclaim the hearts and the souls of the people who feel caught in the middle of this.
That's really helpful. And I'll just say that on our polling as well, that we saw that the highest value, the most popular value associated with church-state separation is religious freedom. So there's that word again, popping for us. I mean, really popping, and so I think it's really important that we do speak about our values in positive terms, like the other side keeps manipulatively doing. You mentioned Hobby Lobby. So of course I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a question about the Supreme Court, where I know there's a lot of anxiety, and really just sort of the courts in general, but obviously the Supreme Court with Ruth Bader Ginsburg being sick, and it feeling very precarious, even, winning in the June medical decision, but only in a 5-4 decision, right? When it was such an obvious replication of stare decisis, of, a decision that had already been made in whole women's health. How bad is this situation in terms of the courts being stacked against us on abortion? And what's the solution?
I think it's bad. It's certainly a challenge as someone who believes in the power of organizing to want to actually celebrate a victory no matter how narrow it is, and not allow for people to get complacent and say, oh, well, then we're fine, right? As you're talking about in June medical, the decision. I would say a couple things, and it's really, I think both are equally important. The courts are not, as people believe, sort of humans who go into hermetically sealed chambers as soon as they become justices, and therefore are only poring over ancient texts to make their decisions, right? And I think that's what we saw in June medical, is that Roberts would have loved to be able to side with the conservative minority in that case, but we actually were able to convince him through campaigns and organizings and using our public platforms that doing so would really jeopardize the legitimacy of the court and put his legacy in play in a way that he was very uncomfortable with. And so vigilance and speaking up is really important. I would say, much like we talked about Federalist Society being, using abortion as a litmus test for hostility to other forms of social progress and rights in their sort of qualifications for the legal minds that they were elevating to judges. As abortion is threatened, so goes everything else, right? It will be the tip of the spear. There is a reason they tested the public's appetite on nuking very recent precedent on an abortion case, because if they could get away with it on an abortion case, then they could follow up with other things that they would like to get rid of as well. And the fact that we had a really strong defense matters not just for abortion, but for their ability to do their bidding. I think that we are needing to have a conversation that is long overdue about what court reform really looks like. I was a member of the DNC platform committee. I filed the amendment language on court reform, which is in the Democratic Party platform for the first time ever. And I'm proud of that, mostly because we can win every election and pass every piece of legislation from now till eternity, and we're still living with a court that Trump has stacked with Federalist Society judges for 30, 40 years. That will undo all of our progress if we don't start to restore balance to the court with people who actually put the rule of law ahead of their own personal ideology. And that's gonna require some new and different activities in the coming years.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's telling it how it is. And I think maybe because there's something depressing in what you just said, I will ask my last question about hope, which is that, the book does this phenomenal job of laying out the strategy of the radical right and how it's been successful. But I also found that there was a message of hope in the book. And I just wondered if you wanted to, and then we're going to open it up for the rest of the time, but if you just wanted to speak to what that hope is about, and kind of if you want to add in any of the how we counter and fight back, that's fine too.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I hope some of you read the book. I hope more of you will. It's a dark read, right? Because it really goes in depth about the history of how this has happened and the consequences, the real life consequences of letting them get away with this strategy. But I ended up where Rachel was, right? Because so much of their strategy relied on our compliance. So much of their strategy relied on our silence. And I think that we are breaking our silence. And I think we will continue to break our silence. And I see that everywhere, right? I've seen it in the largest day of action ever for abortion rights in the Stop the Bans Day in 2019. I'm seeing new generations of politicians and elected officials embrace the issue, not shy away from it. And we're seeing it as we're running media accountability campaigns and challenging the media to stop using right-wing terminology and start covering the issues with facts and experts. I'm also seeing, and I did notice a question in the chat about this, and I think it's really important, that people are starting to extrapolate the natural consequences of having allowed elected officials to run public policy based on ideology and not science. And I say this a lot, right? If we had actually called them out on it when reproductive freedom, justice, and health were the canary in the coal mines, if we had actually had a national defense to legislation that had no grounding in medicine or science, but had everything to do with a control ideology, we might not be where we are in the COVID response. And it is the worst way to learn a lesson, but it does give me hope that we are learning that lesson. We are training our members on a regular basis to spot and combat disinformation in their own social networks and have the courageous conversations that break the silence. So this is hard work. We have a lot to do, but I see real hope in the fact that people are done being quiet. And when people are done being quiet, their house of cards starts to fall down.
I love that. I think, the call to everyone here to, again, use their voice, right? And that's like Ilyse is an organizer, among many other things. And she also is a mother of fraternal twins. And I'm a fraternal twin, in case you didn't know, with a brother. So that's meaningful to me. But when you were reading that passage, Ilyse, I thought, does Ilyse read her book out loud to her twins at night? But I thought, no, you have a lot of experience reading aloud these days.
Why not?
Definitely.
I have a lot of experience reading aloud, a lot of Dr. Seuss and very little Lie That Binds.
But let me start in on some of the questions to make sure that we get to them. Let me start with Joyce Patterson, who asks, how radical is the radical right? Is there a significant segment of the radical right that has given up on the liberal democracy in the US Constitution? Are they prepared to tear the country down to preserve their conservative values? What do you think?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, Joyce, because let me start with a fact that I usually front end, but I didn't. Self-identified Republicans, only 25% of them agree with their own party's position on abortion, and that's to say nothing of independents and Democrats. Think about those odds stacked against you. The GOP, when they made this deal with the radical right back in the 70s and 80s, knew that they were on the wrong side of public opinion. And so as this interdependency has grown, and as we've seen an entire political party in this country hijacked by a minority, they have had to undermine democracy in order to continually maintain power. They're hostage to a radical base that does not reflect public opinion, which is why everywhere you see this sort of radical stance on reproductive freedom, you also see my home state of Texas, Georgia, voter suppression, gerrymandering, stacking the courts, right? They have already shown us everything they need to show us about their willingness to undermine democracy to maintain power. And there's no question, Joyce, we are at an inflection point on that, and November will matter very much, which is why I think it's really important that you actually not only have really strong liberals standing up for voting rights. We work on voting rights because we see it as integral with our mission. But even never Trump Republicans like the Lincoln Project saying, this is bigger than this election. This is about our democracy, because it absolutely is, because they are that radical.
Ilyse, Richard Ressman asks about that spate of abortion bans that happened recently, and asks what the current status is of those bans.
So good news, Richard. This is where we get into the good news, and breaking the silence really has effect. Not a single one of the bans that was, you know, as we say, you had GOP governors with the support of Trump and Pence all over the country trying to use COVID and exploit it as a pretext for closing off access to abortion. Not a single one succeeded. Part of that is injunctions from litigation. We don't litigate, but we certainly love our friends who do. But part of it, and this feels really important to me, and I will go back to my home state of Texas, was because they couldn't withstand public opinion on it. So Governor Abbott in my home state of Texas had to override his own executive order to restore access to the abortion clinics because the backlash was so bad. And NARAL Pro-Choice America ran about $500,000 worth of ads early when this was happening, calling out the GOP governors and the Trump administration for exploiting COVID for their own personal ideology at a time of national emergency. And we tested all of these ads with the voting population, and we found that it was so distasteful that it actually moved soft partisan men away from Trump, which is a hard, I only use them because they are a hard block to use. So they really overstepped here, and they either had to reverse themselves or they just let the injunction take place and they didn't fight it very much because they knew they had lost public opinion.
I want to call out something from the chat box from Ben, who said, in my opinion, he said the RR, so let's call them the radical right or religious right, wants to change the US to a theocratic nation with a select group of white men controlling the rest of us. The only thing that I would alter about what you said, Ben, is I would just put, you know, air quotes around theocratic, right? Because that's what we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, I think that is a really nice summary of what we're talking about right now. So I just wanted to call that out. I wanted to ask you, Ilyse, it's from an anonymous attendee, about the media. I mean, boy, speaking about like the fundamentals of democracy being under threat, we really are living during a time when the media is constantly being called out and frankly repressed. But at the same time, there are a lot of folks who really are critical of the media right now and find that they're, you know, fanning the fuels of division and not being, you know, objective, et cetera. So, you know, this anonymous attendee asked, why isn't the press reporting more on Christian nationalism and Project Blitz? But I'll just expand that to, you know, how are you feeling about what the press is doing on abortion and sort of this battle that we're fighting? Are they representing it? Are they reporting on it adequately? What are your thoughts?
No. The answer is no. You know, part of the impetus for actually writing the book was to do an intervention with the media because we found that their unwillingness to cover what they would call pro-life, what we had previously called anti-choice groups activity, caused a massive blind spot for them in Trump's ascendance, right? Like, part of why Trump beat all odds and all of the prognosticators and pundits missed it is because he was at the epicenter of bringing back together misogynists, more recently called MRAs, men's rights advocates, who are an online force but had never been politicized before Trump, white supremacists, who rose up for the first time in a really long time for Trump, and the traditional sort of anti-choice movement that the media has pigeonholed as sort of like marginal to the radical right infrastructure. And so part of the reason to document their participation, because the white supremacists and the had a massive impact on the dialogue and the enthusiasm, and certainly many of them packed stadiums and all of that, but nobody had the infrastructure. Nobody had the organizing infrastructure that the anti-choice movement did to put Trump over the edge, and it was not reported on. And so we wanted to do this intervention to call them out for the threat that they are, to pull back the veil on what they are. The reason they were happy to work with misogynists and white supremacists is because they are misogynists and white supremacists. And I think it extends beyond that. We did a really comprehensive study with global strategy groups on the media's uptake of right-wing terms. So through the abortion bans, they used heartbeat bill, even though medical professionals were disputing the veracity of that term all the time. They most often had politicians on to talk about the abortion debate rather than people who were affected by it or health professionals who actually provide services in the, in reproductive health. And so we published that report, and we now have an ongoing media accountability project that follows up on it. I think we have a long way to go, but the last thing I will say is because they have felt so under fire for their early inability to call Trump out on his lies, they are more sensitive. Mm-hmm. Not calling out disinformation, and so I think we're getting some traction there.
On that topic, since you just used the word, someone else had asked, what is the difference between disinformation and misinformation?
I mean, this is something that is actually debated by academics quite a bit, and I think people are still trying to like figure it out. Disinformation is an intentional strategy and campaign to put false facts in the middle of a political or public policy debate, right? Unfortunately, and I try not to repeat their rhetoric, but I will in this case, the idea that Democrats stand for and that there are women and doctors involved in infanticide right now is absolutely disinformation. It is absolutely disinformation. The idea that you can't get pregnant from rape is disproven disinformation they continue to perpetuate for political gain. Misinformation tends to be sort of like, oh, wow, women are, like not informed, or, like what you talked about, parental consent. Well, of course, the idea that like parents should have participation in their children's decisions about pregnancy, which is like, they already do, they are, right? Like the law is actually there to protect children or minors, I should say, who do not have those parents, or, so that's like more like, how do we actually use stereotypes in a way that's not like an outright lie, but actually pulls on people's heartstrings in a different way.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Let's see, I'm trying to tick off some of these. And by the way, that one was Helen, by the way, who asked that question. Gordon Smith talks about how he has a friend who buys into the whole radical right thing, who would never read your book, Ilyse. But is there a 1 to 2 page summary or an article? I'm thinking I really enjoyed I think it was in Cosmo. Is that where you wrote that? That's one summary, but is there something else that you have that's short that we can send out to the folks who were on this call?
Yeah, there were about 6 or 7 excerpts from the book, and I'll catalog them for Rachel. And since she knows you all the best, I find that when you have friends who are resistant to information, both the content and the source matter. So we have a sort of wide variety from Newsweek to Marie Claire to, so we'll send those around and Rachel can share them with you.
That would be great. And then I just want to also address, there's some questions that are coming in, how long have Catholics been against abortion? And then Craig comes in and says, anti-abortion is not just an obsession of the radical right, the Catholic hierarchy, if not the Catholic laity. And I think it's actually really important to distinguish the hierarchy from Catholics. Has always been anti-choice. The new alliance between Catholics and evangelicals on issues like contraception, abortion, gay rights, after decades of mutual hostility, is critical to their movement's success. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's right, Craig. When I came into my job, actually printed up and still keep a copy of Mario Cuomo's speech at Notre Dame about why Catholic, as a pro-life individual, he was mandated to govern in a pro-choice manner. And actually, if you have not looked at that speech lately, it's perfectly aligned with your interest because it all went to religious liberty. It is absolutely true that the Catholic hierarchy has always been anti-abortion. What is not true is that it was a central concern and priority for them when we started documenting their sort of involvement in politics. It was there. They talked about it. They certainly lobbied on it, but they didn't lobby on it as much as death penalty or school choice, funding for parochial schools and things like that. And so they have sort of evolved with the decision of the evangelicals to centralize the issue. And, I'm not Catholic, so I'm not trying to speak for Catholics. However, I will say that Catholics, it is a proven fact that Catholics get abortions at the same rate as everyone else. And in fact, there is more and more evidence that particularly Catholic families believe that even if they are anti-abortion, it is a family issue and not a government issue. That being said, the Catholic hierarchy has some mutual interests. They are very patriarchal. They are very anti-LGBTQ. And so there is a lot of alignment there in terms of the concern about a changing world and what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask you this one, because this is sort of coming at us from lots of different places I see. And I think it's a really important one, Ilyse, for you to give guidance on, right? Because the issue of abortion is one that's laden, as we're learning, right? With so many other things, white supremacy, patriarchy, but it's also, in and of itself, a, complicated decision for a lot of people and a complicated issue. One of our members in the box says, how does Ilyse deal with the claim that abortion is murder? Gail, that was from Diane and John. Gail in the Q&A asks, about the use of unborn child and what can be done to counter it. Another one of our members, and I just read it earlier, forgive me for not using your name, says, there are like these arguments that are used against, abortion, and one of them is anti-science and another one is religion. Is there a place where I can go to that has a summary of these arguments? So why don't you address sort of like the arguments that are made on the other side and how you deal with those questions?
It's an excellent question. And I think we have to start from what's the goal, right? So Ilyse Hogue, president of NARAL, who is actually looking in a constrained resource environment that we always look at about how to talk to voters in service of the mission that I have. I don't actually deal with people who truly believe abortion is murder, because that is really a small minority of people who we are never going to get anyway, because they hold all of these other regressive beliefs. So, that's a little bit of like, let's actually talk to the people who are discomforted by the conversation. Let's talk to the people who believe that this is an individual decision that politicians should be making, but also want to they're uncomfortable, right? And we have to create space for that conversation about discomfort, right? There have been times, of course, where I think it's an important intellectual exercise. I talked to an academic at UNC who said that between the generation spawn, and we didn't get into this and we don't have time, but there's an entire podcast episode and a chapter of the book that deals with domestic terrorism around abortion, and then how the men's rights advocates learned from the clinic terrorists about their own tactics and strategies, where we now see them driving vans into groups of people or shooting up Santa Barbara because they think women are denying them their space in the world. This academic was making the point that we've got generations that actually may end up having to go through deprogramming because of this intentional propaganda campaign around misogyny and anti-choice ideology. However, we actually have people in our organization, and have had people in our organization, who come out of the fundamentalist movement where they were taught that. And they talk about their own journey from really challenging that idea. But one of the things that I've always found interesting as a sort of intellectual exercise with people who truly believe that is to say to people, if you truly believe that abortion is murder, why are you not out advocating for a woman having an abortion to get the same level of punishment as a person who kills a full-grown human? Because very few people are. Very few people are. And I think it opens the door to a conversation about shades of gray that actually can lead really interesting places. Now, more recently, there's a danger in that, because there are states that actually are starting to treat abortion as murder. And so be real careful with that, because we are seeing those true believers ascend in politics, and put forward that legislation, even though most people don't agree with it. And that's very scary.
Thanks, Ilyse. That's really important to hear from you. So I just want to, first I just want to say, like, whew, that time flew by. Like technically we're done with our time. So I kind of want to wrap here and say just a couple of really quick things. Number one, I don't know how many of you members really read my weekend reviews, but one of the things that I said in the one that I sent on Saturday was that Ilyse's, it's one of my favorite facts about Ilyse, that her favorite animal is a shark. And I just want to say that I hope you've seen a little bit of why that is the case today. And I just like, join me in applauding. Ilyse can't hear. This isn't like, you know, where Ilyse can see all of your screens with all of your applause, but I know you're feeling it. So just go for it in the middle of your home or wherever you are, because Ilyse, you were phenomenal. And we're all so lucky to have you fighting with all of your smarts and grit and intelligence and strategy for all of our, you know, equity, equality, and well-being. So that's the first thing that I want to say. And the second thing that I want to just say is to you all who are, you know, all of you 129 strong, still on the phone, really liked what Ilyse had to say clearly, and on the Zoom, to say to you all that, you know, there is this effort to have disguised this misogyny and this white supremacy, you know, in the guise of religion, right? That Ilyse's book talks about. And then there's some true believers as well. We've talked about some of the Catholic hierarchy and some of the new generation who's being raised with this theology. But no matter which one of those things it is, what we all can work on is ensuring that the government keeps religion and government separate, right? Because that way we know that one narrow, call it religious, call it political point of view is never going to dictate all of our own choices and freedoms, you know, and that's what you all who have joined us for Zoom are supporting every day and partnering with us on every day. And I thank you so much for being in this fight with us all. You are incredible allies in the battle. And thanks, Ilyse, again for joining us.
This has been such a pleasure, and thank you all for all you do.
Bye.